Today we're going to be talking about the Russian oil industry. And the Russian oil industry can really be broken down into three major categories. The history of oil in Russia, how Russia's political relations have influenced the oil industry itself, and also the local and global economy and how it's affected by the Russian oil industry. We'll start by talking about the history of the Russian oil industry, and to start this, we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning. Oil was first discovered in Russia in 1745 along the banks of the Ukhtet River. The first oil that was found in Russia was refined and then used as kerosene to light lamps. Now, the two people really responsible for driving the oil industry in Russia was Robert and Ludwig Noble, and they are the catalyst that drove the Russian oil industry. When it first started, oil was just scooped from a well in with a wooden bucket and was just put into a trough, and then that oil would be divvied up and transported by donkey to wherever it was supposed to go. At the beginning, there were many different people all trying to get a piece of the oil business, but the Noble brothers really they were the ones that industrialized it. They introduced pumps, pipelines, railroad transport, and they even invented the first tanker. And these new methods were just significantly more cost-effective than what the oil industry could have done beforehand, and because of that, it really took off. The first refinery was constructed by Fyodor Pryadanov, and this was done under the rule of Emperor Elizabeth. At the same time that the Russian oil industry was taking off in the late 1800s, this was happening elsewhere in the world too, and the best example of this would be John D. Rockefeller in America. And by the start of the 1900s, Rockefeller had cornered the market, and because of this, all the other oil companies had to join together if they wanted to even have a chance of surviving in the market that Rockefeller had created. So the Noble brothers ended up merging with the Rothschild family to form the British Syndicate. And then later in 1906, they formed the Europolish Petroleum Union, which ended up being the world's first oil cartel. Alright, so now that you have a basic idea of how the oil industry started in Russia, we're going to look a little bit more into how Russian foreign relations really impacts the industry. The Russian oil industry is hugely reliant on maintaining civil foreign relations, and this is because even though Russia is the #1 producer of crude oil in the world, they are not even close to the #1 consumer, and this means that for the industry to be profitable at all, they're going to have to export a good bit of their product. Most of the product that gets exported out of Russia ends up somewhere else in Europe. In 2014, 70% of the oil that Russia exported and 90% of the natural gas was exported to somewhere in Europe. And this means that the relationship between Europe and Russia is just key to the Russian oil industry's success. If the relationship becomes rocky and all of a sudden the rest of Europe doesn't want to buy Russia's oil, the Russian oil industry will take huge hits because their biggest customer now has no interest in their product. As it stands right now, the relationship between Europe and Russia is mutually beneficial. Europe has the demand for oil. They don't have the supply. Russia has the supply of oil, they don't have the demand. The two of them work together very well. And because of this, both of them try to keep each other's best interest when they're making decisions. On the other hand, the United States and Russia have no such arrangement. The US is not dependent at all on Russian oil, and because of this, when Russia starts doing Russia sort of things and invading countries, the US will just be like, none of that. And they will pull all of their funding out of Russia, and because of that, the Russian oil industry takes a huge hit. The most recent instance of this was in 2014 when Russia invaded the Ukraine. In response, the US promptly pulled out all of their companies, including ExxonMobil, and because of this, many of the places Russia was currently drilling for oil, they could no longer do because their technology was not far enough along for them to drill in the harsh climates of the Russian winters. Because of how interconnected both world governments and world economies are these days, Russia can't simply take the stance of, we're Russia, we're just going to do what we want, and we're going to isolate ourselves to do what we want. Instead, Russia has to find a place to meet in the middle with the other countries, and this really poses a problem for President Putin. Usually, he wants to say, I'm Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to get my way. And the rest of the world just isn't going to let him get away with that. So Putin has to find a balance where instead of just winning every single battle, he still needs to put on, for the Russian people, he still needs to be able to say, look, I got us this, I got us this. But he also needs to know where to pick and choose his battles and not do something that will, in the long run, just turn the Russian oil industry on a downward spiral that's unrecoverable. A great example of this is the Ukraine debacle. Right now, Russia is in one of the worst downturns in the oil industry in the history of the Russian oil industry. But they have the opportunity to turn this and become self-sufficient. And if they can do that and develop their own drilling technology, now they're not reliant on foreign countries to be able to provide them with the technology they need to drill their wells. And if they can do this, they can lower the prices it costs to produce their oil, and they can become more competitive worldwide. So they can turn this negative of the Ukraine into a positive that will strengthen the industry overall. The other option the Russians have, if they decide that they don't want to invest the money to become self-sufficient on their own, is to partner up with the Chinese. China is one of the fastest growing countries in the world, and because of this, the energy they need to make their empire work is just astronomical. But one thing that the Chinese do have is they have the ability to just throw manpower at the problem until it goes away. And what they can do is they can start developing drills for Russia, so Russia can start drilling the parts of their country that they weren't able to do on their own. And by doing this, the Chinese can give the Russians the drills for cheap, and in return, the Russians now have a huge market in China that they can sell their product to. China solves their energy crisis. Russia's now self-sufficient. Everybody wins. Russia's in the mess they're in with the economic sanctions being levied by many different countries because of poor policy decisions. But they can turn these poor policy decisions with a couple good decisions. They can end up accelerating the Russian oil program and being far and away ahead of where they were before the boneheaded decision to invade the Ukraine. Now that you have a better idea of what's going on the political side, let's take a look at the economic side and really see what's going on in the Russian oil industry. As I said earlier, Russia is the largest gas producer and the third largest oil producer in the world. And the way the Russian oil system is set up is they have two main state-run monopolies: Gazprom, which handles the natural gas, and Transneft, which is more the oil pipeline. Over half of Russia's trade exports and over 30% of the country's total GDP is tied up in the oil industry. But because the oil industry is completely state-run, all of the money goes straight into the government and it doesn't get distributed quite as well among the people. The economics and the politics of the Russian oil industry are very intertwined, and they can be seen in the fact that three of the most major downturns in the Russian oil industry all were a direct result of poor decision making as far as political moves go. If you first look at the Russian oil industry in 1979, at its peak, the price of oil was $101 a barrel. Now, Russia took this and they're like, we're now flush with cash. What should we do? Let's go invade Afghanistan. And that's exactly what they did. And 7 years later, in 1986, oil prices had plummeted to under $30 a barrel. Now, Russia's never really been known to learn from their mistakes, and this is no exception. In 2008, oil prices were once again over $100 a barrel at $105. And Russia now takes this, and we have a lot of money, so what should we do? Let's go invade Georgia. And that's what they did, and once again the bottom fell out of oil prices because of these poor political decisions. And then less than 10 years after what happened in Georgia, the market started to recover again, oil prices started to go up, and Russia has the great idea, let's go invade the Ukraine. And they do that, and now everyone's coming out of the woodworks to lay some economic sanctions on Russia, and the result of this is the price of oil plummets once again. Now, Russia's had their fair share of self-inflicted wounds that have caused the price of oil to decline, but they've also been the victim of circumstance, and the best example of this is the fall of the Soviet Union. From 1988 to 1992, oil production in Russia fell 30%, roughly 9% a year, and this downturn really happened because of outdated technology and then just lack of foreign investment. As the Soviet Union really started to scream towards collapse, their economy followed suit. Starting in 1985, the Soviet Union started racking up an obscene amount of debt, and then their master plan to get out of this was they were going to get 300 banks to raise $1 million collectively, and they could only get about 5 banks to actually buy into it. So when they couldn't solve their problems in-house, what they had to do was essentially agree with other countries. It's like, we'll take your side on this argument if you give us money. And that didn't go over well with any of the people in the Russian government or the Russian people. And at the same time this was happening, Russia was also having to deal with the fact that for the last 30 years or so, North Korea, Cuba, any Eastern European country that supported communism had all been getting subsidized oil rates from Russia. They were giving out these subsidies to try to help keep communism in play in all these different countries, but they had to face the fact that their economy was just in shambles and they were no longer able to give out these subsidies to the countries that they were at one point able to. So once Russia wasn't subsidizing these countries' oil prices, a free market system came in and essentially eradicated communism from all the countries, because at that point it was just whoever could deliver the lowest price was getting the contracts. Russia's most definitely had a speckled past as far as owning an oil company is concerned, but 2015, for example, was a down year for oil internationally, and despite the global downturn in oil prices, Russia produced its largest volume of oil since before the fall of the Soviet Union. So this suggests that with proper management and like a couple smart decisions getting made, Russia could once again start gaining some momentum, and following this downturn they could sit atop the world powers in the oil industry again.